Rain lashed Lenora's face as she watched Gideon wrestle the panicked stallion. He couldn't calm it, his voice stolen years ago by a bullet meant for his heart. He needs a sound, she thought, stepping into the storm's fury with a melody only we, the audience, know will break more than the silence in the barn. Stood alone at the edge of the world. It belonged to Gideon Cole, a man made of leather and silence. He had not spoken a full sentence in 6 years. The bullet that shattered his throat in a shootout outside Abilene didn't kill him, but it had killed something else. His voice, his confidence, his ability to look a person in the eye for too long. Since then, he'd spoken with nods, the occasional grunt, and when necessary, chalk on a slate board nailed beside the front door. Gideon lived alone, save for his horses, cattle, and the ache of memory, but not for much longer. Not if that letter had meant what he thought it did. He had written to a mail-order bride agency in Missouri with one simple request: young, gentle, no past, no lies. He wanted something untouched by sorrow, a girl who might look at him without fear, disgust, or the need to ask him about the scar beneath his jaw. He was not looking for love, just peace, a voice in the house that wasn't his own. Now, as the stagecoach kicked up dust on the ridge, Gideon adjusted his hat and stepped onto the porch. The sun was dropping low behind the hills, casting the ranch in copper and crimson. He stood still, boots planted wide, arms crossed, as the coach rolled to a stop in front of his gate. The driver tipped his hat. "Got a delivery for a Mr. Gideon Cole." Gideon gave a sharp nod. The coach door opened with a creak, and the woman who stepped down was not the girl he had imagined. She wore a long black dress worn thin at the elbows. Her face was pale with a sharpness born of hard winters and longer nights. Her eyes were red-rimmed, not from dust, but from crying. She clutched a battered leather like it held the last pieces of herself. She looked up at him once, just long enough for him to see it, the grief deep and unhealed. This was no innocent girl, no untouched bride. Gideon's stomach clenched, his shoulders stiffened, and he took an unconscious step back. A wind stirred between them, lifting the hem of her skirt and tugging at her travel-stained bonnet. The woman swallowed, then spoke in a voice barely louder than the breeze. If I am not what you expected, I can go back." Her voice trembled. "Just say the word, Mr. Cole. I will not make trouble." She did not plead. She did not explain. She simply waited. Gideon stared at her, his throat tightening, not from pain, but from the weight of the moment. He'd asked for simplicity, purity, a fresh start. And standing before him was a widow, hollow-eyed and haunted. A storm where he had asked for calm, but something in her, perhaps the way her fingers trembled, or the cracked leather shoes that had clearly walked too far, made him hesitate. She was not what he wanted, but maybe she was what he deserved. Without a word, he stepped aside and pointed toward the door. "The woman, Lenora Hayes," he presumed, not at once, almost like she had expected this reaction. She gathered her skirts and moved slowly past him, eyes downcast. As she crossed the threshold into his home, the scent of dust and lilacs followed her in. Gideon stood for a long moment on the porch, staring at the horizon. The stagecoach turned back down the road, kicking up gravel as it disappeared into the dying light. He exhaled slowly through his nose, then turned and closed the door behind him. Inside the house, the silence was thicker than ever, but now it was no longer empty. It held the breathing of two people, one trying to remember how to speak, the other trying to remember how to stay. And somewhere deep within Gideon's chest, beneath the silence and the scar, something stirred. Not hope, not yet, but the ache of it. Lenora Hayes had learned long ago how to enter a room without making a sound. In her first marriage, silence had been safety. Her husband, a horse broker in Kansas City, had a temper quicker than his boots. He died when a wild stallion threw him against a barn wall, neck snapped, dead before he hit the ground. In her second, silence had been shame. The man she married for protection during the war had a good heart, but poor luck. He was gunned down on a trade road outside Topeka, left bleeding in the dust with no witnesses. The sheriff said it was bandits. His family said otherwise. They called her cursed. "Black Widow," they whispered, not to her face but behind her back, just loud enough for the words to cling to her skirts. By the time she boarded the stage to Dusty Creek, Lenora had buried 2 husbands and every last shred of her reputation. She did not come looking for romance. She came looking for quiet, a place where her name meant nothing and her past could be folded away like a yellowed letter no one would read again. And this place, this ranch owned by a silent man with calloused hands and a house full of ghosts, might be the closest thing to sanctuary she would ever find. The days were marked by the steady rhythm of hooves on dirt and the hiss of the fire in the hearth. Gideon said nothing to her. He did not try. Instead, he scribbled short messages on a slate with chalk that barely held together. "Otters in the barrel," reads on the table. "I write out at dawn." His handwriting was jagged, not because he was uneducated, but because he wrote like a man who did not believe in softness. Yet beneath each clipped note, Lenora saw care. He never left her guessing where things were. He never locked the door. She watched him from the window as he worked the fields, shirt clinging to sweat-slick shoulders, hat low over his brow. He moved with the stillness of someone who had been broken and rebuilt with the wrong tools, functional but no longer whole. At night, she lay on a narrow bed in a room that smelled faintly of cedar and old ash. The wind cried through the walls like a child with bad dreams. She did not sleep easily. Still, there were gestures. The third evening, after a cold day tending fences, Lenora returned to her room to find a bowl of soup, hot, thick, and set on a folded napkin outside her door. There was no note, no knock, only the warmth of it, and the faint steam curling like a question. She stared at it for a long time. When she finally picked up the bowl, her hands trembled. He was not what she feared, nor was he what she expected. He had not asked about her past. He had not stared too long. He had not tried to touch her, not even once. That night, as she sipped the broth and watched the fire gutter low, she whispered into the silence, more to herself than anyone else. "You are not like the men they warned me about." In her mind, she could still hear the voices from the saloons and the train stations, from the hissing mouths of women with better luck and cleaner reputations. Never trust a man who doesn't talk. They're the ones who think too much. But Gideon's silence felt different. Not dangerous, just wounded. And in that, she saw a reflection of herself. 2 broken people living beneath the same roof, not yet reaching, but no longer recoiling. It was not love, not yet, but it was something she could breathe in. And for Lenora Hayes, that was more than she had dared to hope for. The days moved like dust on the wind, slow, quiet, and unnoticed until evening came. Lenora found a rhythm in the silence. The ranch had its own language, one of creaking floorboards, distant cattle calls, and the muffled thud of Gideon's boots outside her door. He never knocked, he never spoke, but he was present, and in that presence, she began to feel something she had not known in years. Safety. It started with the scarf. She had dropped it somewhere between the barn and the smokehouse, the breeze stealing it from her neck. That evening she searched for it, but gave up when the light faded. By morning, it was folded neatly on the wooden chair beside the hearth, clean, pressed, still slightly damp from drying. She picked it up slowly, fingers brushing the worn fabric. He had found it. He had washed it. He had said nothing. Later that day, she noticed the new planks hammered into the side of the house near her window, a makeshift barrier against the wind, secured with thick nails and a careful hand. She hadn't asked for it, hadn't even mentioned the draft. Still, he had seen. She watched him from behind the curtain as he worked the fence line, his hat pulled low, sleeves rolled to the elbows. He moved like a man used to doing everything alone, efficient, deliberate, but with a weight to each motion, like each task was a way to outrun memory. At supper, she noticed he had sliced a loaf of bread, a rarity on the ranch. 2 thick pieces sat on her plate while he quietly tore at dried beef and beans. She looked at the bread, then at him. His eyes were on the fire. "You should have some," she offered gently. He didn't respond, just shook his head once. Firm, she broke a piece in half and left it on the edge of his plate anyway. Later, she found it gone. It was not affection, not in the way she had once known it. There were no soft touches, no lingering stares, but in every small gesture, in every repaired window, every quiet offering, she felt something stir, respect, care, perhaps even the fragile beginnings of trust. But trust was a brittle thing, and the world outside the ranch did not forget so easily. The first time she went into town alone, she wore a borrowed bonnet and carried Gideon's list of supplies. The general store was small, cluttered, the floor dusty and uneven. She kept her head down as she picked up sugar, salt, oil, and lye. The clerk barely looked at her, but the other shoppers, mostly women, stared. Too long behind her, she heard the whisper. "That's her, the one from Kansas." Another voice, sharper. "Black Widow," they called her. Lenora froze, sugar sack clutched in her hand. The whispering didn't stop. She buried 2 husbands. You know, bad luck follows her like smoke. She bewitched them, more like. She paid in silence, the coins trembling in her hand, and walked out into the sun with her basket held tight against her chest. By the time she reached the wagon, her face burned, not from shame, but from something colder. The past had found her, even here. That night she didn't speak at dinner, didn't eat much either. Gideon noticed, his chalk scraped across the board. Bad day. She hesitated, then nodded once. He held her gaze a beat longer than usual, then stood and walked out into the dusk. She heard the barn door slam shut. Moments later, the rhythmic pounding of hammer on wood. She didn't know what he was building, but somehow it made her feel seen. In a world that only seemed to remember her sins, Gideon was doing something radical. He was letting her forget. The storm came in from the west like a thing alive. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened into bruises across the sky. The air turned electric, heavy, and still. Horses grew restless in their stalls. The cattle paced. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Gideon smelled the rain before it came. He stood on the porch, watching the line of darkness crawl across the horizon like spilled ink. His jaw tightened. Storms out here were not just weather. They were war. He moved quickly, wordlessly. Ropes, gates, lanterns. He pointed toward the house, gesturing for Lenore to stay inside. She stood in the doorway, shawl wrapped tight, watching him with growing concern. Then the thunder cracked, sharp as a rifle shot. The first drops fell, fat and cold, and the wind screamed to life. From the barn, the horses whinnied in panic. Gideon sprinted into the chaos. Lenora hesitated only a second before she grabbed a lantern and followed him. Rain lashed the yard in sheets, turning dirt to mud, slapping her skin like fists. She could barely see 3 feet ahead, but the flash of lightning lit the outline of the barn, and she ran toward it. He inside the animals were wild. A stallion reared, nearly kicking through its gate. Another mare kicked at the walls, eyes rolling white with terror. Gideon moved between them, soaked to the bone, arms outstretched to calm them. His voice useless, could offer nothing. Lenora clutched the wooden post, heart racing. "Gideon," she called, but he couldn't hear her over the storm. She watched him struggle, hands trembling, body heaving with effort, and she realized in that moment of pure instinct that what the horses needed was not strength. They needed a sound, a voice. She stepped into the middle of the barn, closed her eyes and began to sing. It was an old hymn, something her mother used to hum by lamplight long ago. A lullaby woven with memory, soaked in prayer. Her voice cut through the storm, soft at first, then stronger. "Rock of ages, cleft for me. Let me hide myself in thee." The melody floated over the thunder, threading through the stalls like smoke. The stallion stilled, ears twitching toward her. The mare stopped kicking. One by one, the horses turned, their panic giving way to something quieter, something ancient. Gideon stopped moving. Slowly he turned to her. She stood there in the center of it all, soaked, radiant, singing like she wasn't afraid of anything, like the storm had no power over her. Rain pounded the roof, lightning flashed behind her like a halo, and Gideon felt something snap inside him. He did not know what to call it. It wasn't pain. It wasn't joy. It was too deep for either. His throat tightened, his hands clenched, and then without warning, tears welled in his eyes. He hadn't cried in years. Not when his father died, not when the bullet took his voice, not even in the darkest, loneliest nights on this God-forsaken land. But now in the middle of a barn full of half-wild animals, and the woman he barely knew, he felt them come slow, hot, and without shame. He leaned against the stall door, chest rising hard with each breath, and watched her finish the hymn. Be of sin the double cure, save from wrath and make me pure. The silence that followed was full, not empty, the kind of silence that hums with everything unsaid. Lenora opened her eyes and looked at him. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just stood there, the rain dripping from her hair, her chest rising and falling with a rhythm of a heart that had given everything it had. And in that moment, Gideon thought, if there are angels in this world, they do not come with wings. They come with voices strong enough to silence storms. The calm after the storm did not last. For a few days, things at the ranch settled into something that almost felt like peace. The barn was quiet, the horses calm. Gideon moved through his chores with a renewed energy, and Lenora noticed he lingered longer at the dinner table, as if he found some comfort in her presence. She sang to herself now, soft hymns as she swept the porch or folded laundry. It was not happiness, not yet, but it was a fragile beginning. Then the stranger arrived. Dusty Creek had never been a town to embrace newcomers. It tolerated them, and sometimes it let them speak too freely. The man was tall, lean, with a crooked smile and a mouthful of stories he was far too eager to share. He walked into the saloon one late afternoon, ordered whiskey, and began talking before the barkeep could even ask his name. Passed through Kansas last fall, he said, voice thick with swagger. Heard a tale about a woman, pretty thing, dressed all in black. They said she buried 2 husbands and not a tear at either funeral. He took a long sip. They call her the Black Widow. Got a talent for making men disappear. Found herself a new home in these parts, I hear, on a ranch with a mute man who doesn't ask questions. By sundown, the story had wrapped itself around every porch post and hitching rail in town. By the next morning, it had reached the general store, the church, the sheriff's office, and the eyes of every woman Lenora passed when she came into town for flour and lamp oil. The whispers followed her like dust in the wind. She's the one. 2 husbands, both dead. She probably cast some spell on him. Poor Gideon. She kept her chin up, stepped steady, but she felt it, the shift, the sideways glances, the small children pulled behind skirts, the space that opened around her like she carried disease. Then the rock hit her, a small jagged thing thrown from a child's hand. Or maybe not a child at all. It struck her hip hard enough to bruise. She stumbled, clutching her basket, blinking back tears she would not let fall. She did not cry, not when her first husband raised his voice, not when the second died on the roadside. But this slow public death by rumor was something cruel. She turned to leave, the weight of shame crushing down, and saw him. Gideon, he stood at the end of the street, eyes locked on hers. He had come into town without her noticing, perhaps tracking her from the ridge. His hat was low, coat damp from an earlier rain, but his presence was as sharp as a blade in the sun. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps, and when another voice in the crowd dared mutter, "Should have let the snake die alone," Gideon stopped. His hand slid to the butt of his revolver. Not to draw, but to rest. A promise. He turned his head and looked directly at the stranger standing on the saloon steps, the man with the crooked smile who had started it all. That smile faltered. The crowd held its breath. Then Gideon walked past Lenora, knelt at the side of the store wall, and picked up a small piece of wood propped beside a barrel. He took the chalk tied to it, scrolled one word in thick, sharp letters. Enough. He turned the board to face the crowd and held it high. Then he placed it at her feet, stood beside her, and stared at every eye that dared meet his. No one spoke. No one moved. Lenora stood frozen, heart hammering against her ribs. In that moment, she realized something vital. Gideon's silence was not absence. It was choice. He did not hide behind it. He used it like armor, like a weapon. And when he stood between her and the world without a single word, she felt more protected than she had ever felt in her life. The wind howled that night, like it was mourning something. The ranch was quiet, save for the creak of old wood and the restless stir of horses in the barn. Gideon had gone to bed early. Lenora had not. Sleep had evaded her for days, pushed away by the weight of looks, whispers, and stones thrown without names. The town's cruelty had followed her home like a stray dog she could not shake. Even here, even after everything, the past clung to her like a second skin. She needed air. Barefoot shawl wrapped tight, she stepped out into the night and made her way to the barn. The familiar scent of hay and earth should have calmed her. Instead, it made the knot in her chest tighten. She walked past the stalls slowly, running her fingers along the rough wood. And then, without warning, her legs gave way. She sank into the straw beside one of the empty stalls, pulling her knees to her chest. Her breath hitched. The tears came soundlessly, but not softly. They spilled like a flood she had been holding back for years. She cried for the husbands buried in cold ground, for the names she had been called, for the silence she had learned to live inside. But mostly she cried because she had started to hope again, and that was the cruelest cut of all. She did not hear him come in, only felt the shift in the air as Gideon knelt beside her, his presence sudden and solid. She didn't look up, couldn't. He sat in the straw without a word, his coat brushing hers. And then he moved. He reached for the small knife he kept at his belt, not for protection tonight, but for something else. She watched through blurred vision as he turned and with deliberate care began to carve into the wooden wall of the stall. His hand trembled. His breath was ragged. The sound of the blade scraping wood was steady, slow. When he finished, he sat back and turned toward her. She looked. 4 words etched with trembling lines but undeniable conviction. "You don't deserve shame." Lenora blinked. A new tear slipped down her cheek. He could not say it, but he had cut it into the wood with his own hands. She reached out, touched the carving lightly, and then looked at him. His eyes were on her, not pitying, not distant. Seeing her, truly seeing her, she leaned forward, lifted her trembling hand, and placed it gently against his mouth. His breath caught. "If you can't speak," she whispered, voice quivering, "then I will sing for you." He closed his eyes, not to hide, but to let the feeling in. There in the dark barn, surrounded by the quiet breath of animals and the scent of hay, something passed between them. Not a confession, not a promise, but a knowing. 2 hearts, bruised and weary, finding each other not in words but in what had never been said. The dust arrived before the riders did. From the front porch, Gideon watched the thin line of horses crest the ridge and descend toward the ranch. 6 of them, 1 wagon. A storm without thunder, but just as loud in its intent. Lenora stood inside the doorway, clutching the edge of the curtain. She didn't need to ask who they were. She already knew. The wagon carried Harold Granger, brother of her second husband, and 2 other men in clean Sunday coats, who smelled of self-righteousness. Behind them rode a hired gun in a black hat and dust-covered duster. His eyes were small and pale, like stones found in a dry riverbed. They stopped a few yards from the porch. Harold stepped down and called out, "Miss Hayes, or should I say Miss Graves again?" Gideon stepped forward, placing himself between Lenora and the gathering crowd that had begun to form behind the riders. Townsfolk, curious, judgmental, waiting for the next scandal to unfold, like a page in a dime novel. "She married my brother under false pretenses," Harold declared, "and he died less than 6 months later. We never had the chance to investigate. Now she's fled here and stolen herself another man. We have a right to bring her back. There's justice to be done." Lenora stepped out slowly, pale and trembling. Her voice was barely above the wind. "You have no claim on me." "You ran," Heo barked. "What honest woman runs?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The hired gun rested his hand on his holster. Gideon stepped forward. He did not speak, but his stance said enough. He pulled his revolver from its holster with a slow, deliberate motion and stood square in front of Lenora, his eyes locked on the gunman's, daring him, challenging him. "You'll have to go through me," the gunman grinned. "You show about this, Moo." The crowd tensed, hands twitched toward belts. Horses stamped in the rising heat. And then it happened. A flash, a crack, dust and fire. The hired gun went down, clutching his leg, blood soaking his pants. Gideon turned to the next man, Harold's companion, and fired. The man dropped his weapon and dove behind the wagon. Harold screamed something unintelligible. Gideon raised his pistol again, but too late. The third shot caught him in the side. He stumbled, fell to one knee, then collapsed onto the porch boards. "Gaideen!" Lenora screamed, running to his side. Blood poured from the wound, dark and fast. She pressed her hands to it, sobbing, her tears falling into the dust. The gunmen scattered. The crowd stood frozen, some backing away, others too stunned to move. And then the chaos grew. One of the horses, spooked by the noise, reared up and broke free from its handler. It bolted through the crowd, wild-eyed and frenzied. Screams echoed as people leapt aside. A small boy tripped and fell right into the horse's path. Lenora saw it happen in a blink. Without thinking, without breathing, she ran. She reached the boy just as the horse bore down, pushing him hard out of the way. The animal clipped her shoulder, sent her spinning into the dirt, but the boy was safe. Silence fell like a curtain. The boy's mother screamed and rushed to him, weeping. Others followed, eyes wide, not at the blood on Lenora's arm or the dirt on her dress, but at the truth they had all just witnessed. "She saved him," someone whispered. "She saved him?" She threw herself in front of that horse. Maybe she's not what they said. The crowd shifted. Gideon groaned. Lenora crawled back to him, still bleeding, still shaking. She took his hand in hers and kissed his knuckles. His eyes fluttered open. For a long moment, he looked at her. Truly looked, and then, with a throat cracked by silence, he forced out the first words anyone had heard him say in nearly 6 years. "My wife is good." The words were raw, but undeniable. Gasps moved through the crowd. Harold turned, face flushed, and climbed into the wagon without a word. The others followed, defeated. The townspeople stepped back, letting them pass. No one looked at Lenora the same again. The spell was broken, the lie undone. And in that moment, the woman they called a curse became something else entirely. She became a truth too powerful to deny. The days that followed moved slow and golden. The ranch, once heavy with silence and wind, now pulsed with quieter rhythms. Footsteps on wooden floors, the clink of spoons and mugs, the hum of a woman's voice in the evenings. Gideon stayed in bed for nearly a week. The bullet had torn through muscle and left him weak and fevered, but he was alive. Because Lenora had run toward danger, not away, because she had chosen him, even when the world hadn't. She tended to him with hands both gentle and steady. She brewed bitter tea from herbs she found near the creek, pressed clean cloths to his wound, and hummed hymns each night as the fire burned low. Sometimes she sat beside him in silence, tracing small circles over his hand. Other times she read from an old Bible they found on the shelf, her voice soft, filling the space where his had long been absent. The ranch changed too. It no longer felt like a place abandoned to ghosts. Now it smelled of bread and pine soap. The wind still came, but it passed through open windows with grace instead of grief. And in that peace, something bloomed inside her. Lenora stood on the porch one morning, sunlight washing her face. She looked across the fields, watched the horses near the fence line. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking of escape. She didn't feel the weight of eyes or the pull of shame. She was exactly where she belonged. Not because she'd been forgiven, but because she'd stopped asking for permission to exist. Inside, Gideon sat propped against pillows, a piece of worn wood in his lap. He carved slowly with his knife. Words now, not fences. He left her small messages each day, scratched into cedar or oak. Some made her laugh. Others made her cry. That morning she found one by the stove. "You're the bravest person I know." Another tucked into her Bible. "I'm proud of you." She ran her fingers over the words like they were sacred. That evening she knelt beside him with a small notebook and a smile. "Say my name," she whispered, "just once." He blinked. His throat still hurt, but he wanted to try for her. She touched his jaw. "I'll help." She shaped the sounds with her lips. "Lenora." He watched her mouth, listened with everything he had. Then with every ounce of breath, he rasped, "Lenora." It came out broken, barely formed, but it came. Her eyes filled. She leaned in, pressed her forehead to his. "You don't have to say anything else," she whispered. That was everything. That night he slept with her hand in his, and when he dreamed, it wasn't of blood or silence, but of sunlight through her hair. 1 week later, the sun dipped low, painting the land in golden fire. Gideon and Lenora sat side by side on the porch steps, a blanket draped across their shoulders. She leaned into him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, his arm around her, fingers curled with hers. The horses grazed in peace. The wind was soft, the sky endless. He looked at her, then at the ring on her finger. She caught his gaze and smiled. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His hand tightened. She knew in a land ruled by dust, silence, and judgment, Gideon and Lenora found something rarer than gold, a love that whispered where others shouted, healed where others ran, and chose trust even when it hurt. If this story moved you, if you felt that quiet kind of love that lingers after the last word, hit that like button to let us know you're riding with us. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of forbidden hearts, fierce devotion, and timeless frontier romance. Tap the bell so you never miss a story where bullets missed but hearts didn't. Until next time, ride safe. And remember, love always finds a way, even in the silence.